Last decade, it was Mt. Gox. This decade, it was FTX. Make money by collecting everyone's data and just trying to get people to buy. If you live in the wrong country, you might even be punished for that. Whatever happens with AI makes the world, unbelievably awesome, or in the worst case, makes it terrible.
So Vitalik, as a crypto and cypherpunk advocate, Ethereum has embraced and emphasizes decentralization, transparency, and privacy. So a lot of people know about Ethereum, but not so familiar with Plurality. Could you answer the following question to help people connect the dots between Ethereum and Plurality? Can you tell us why you like cypherpunk, and what's your definition of cypherpunk in your mind, and what role does cypherpunk play in Plurality?
Yeah, I think the cypherpunk ideas are basically ideas around freedom and openness, creating things that are as accessible and open and fair for people to participate as possible, and what people's rights are protected and all of these things, but just adapted to and implemented using the digital world. Right, I think this has been the dream of people who have been trying to do cypherpunk things almost from the beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, right? Trying to build things like digital cash, digital systems for private property rights, digital voting systems, and do all of these things in a way where security is guaranteed through cryptography, instead of being guaranteed through having to trust centralized authorities, right? Because once your security depends on a centralized authority, then the centralized authority can easily abuse that power, right? And in the physical world, of course, that's sometimes centralized authorities are difficult to avoid because in the physical world, often attacking is easy and defending is hard, right? But it still causes a lot of problems. But the more that happens in the digital world, in the digital world, it's the opposite, right? And you can have things like cryptographic keys where you can make signatures, but breaking those signatures is impossible for even the most powerful attacker, right? And so the more things that you can do that build off of building those kinds of building blocks in the digital world, the less we can rely on and be vulnerable to the failures of centralized authorities in general. Yeah, the goal from the beginning has been to just see how far is it actually possible to to take that direction. And this started with digital cash systems with David Chaum in the 1980s. A lot of these anonymous mailing systems and mixnets in the 1990s. Then, of course, we saw Bitcoin that created the first fully decentralized digital currency. I think now in 2024, we have a very big array of different tools with which to build all of these constructions, right? And we've seen how we can build decentralized currencies, we can build voting systems, we can build all kinds of different things. At the same time, though, we need to have some kind of organized movement that's dedicated to actually doing that, right? Is if there isn't a self-conscious and dedicated movement trying to do these things, then what you get is people inside the crypto space just try to make money off of speculating on tokens, and everyone outside the crypto space tries to make money by collecting everyone's data and just trying to get people to buy pointless products by selling them ads, right? Basically, I think the thing that I want to see Ethereum do more in is actually try to create that organized movement, and that tries to create at least a collection of these organized software tools that can follow these principles and work well with each other and just show people what a better and more open, and more secure, and more privacy-preserving software world could look like.
And with the recent efforts of developing more public goods and laying groundwork of integrating civic technologies, Ethereum aspires to achieve high-resolution democracy. So what are the similarities and differences between Plurality's digital democracy and Ethereum's high-resolution democracy?
Yeah, I think like when I think about high resolution democracy, I mean, I think of the idea that like because we have things like modern information technology, we have the ability to like extract a much higher and like much richer amount of information about people's preferences than was even possible 20 or 30 years ago, right? Like traditionally, we think about just like having an election every 4 years, and that's like basically like maybe 1 bit, maybe 2 bits of information every 4 years, right? Like less than 1 bit per year. That's like a very, very low bandwidth channel. But of course, if all you have is like paper and like you have the kinds of systems that we had 200 or even 50 years ago, that might be the best that you can do. But then now, we actually have all these very powerful information technologies, and the question is like, can we use that to actually like get a lot more information about people's preferences through these mechanisms, right? And look, in our modern internet, we have a lot of examples of what I call micro-democracy. So like take like Twitter, for example, right? Like, you can make a tweet and then people can like the tweet, people can retweet it, you can see how many likes. On Reddit, you can see upvotes, you can see downvotes. Like these are all forms of micro-democracy, right? It's a real-time referendum on basically, is the thing that this person said good or bad? And these referendums happen like millions of times a day, and their results influence like who sees what content, right? Like we have lots of these examples of micro-democracy, and we also have macro-democracy. But at the same time, like there's this challenge that the macro democracy is inefficient and the micro democracy is insecure, right? Like in these social media cases, like there's lots of fake accounts, there's lots of like all kinds of different problems. It's also the voting is not anonymous in micro democracy, right? So if you like a tweet, like there's lots of ways how that might be discovered, and if you live in the wrong country, you might even be punished for that. The challenge with, I think, plurality is to basically see if, like, can we create forms of, like, voting that are both micro and macro and secure, and, like, actually good at extracting a lot of information and the right kind of information about our preferences at the same time, right? And even do it in ways that, like, aren't even, like people haven't even done before, right? Like, I think, like, one of the big successes that I think we've seen in social media in the last 2 years is community notes, right? It's this new algorithm that's on Twitter where it tries to identify, like, notes that are agreed to by people who normally, like, even disagree on other things, and basically try to, like, show like clarifying information or context beside a lot of different tweets. And I mean, this is the sort of thing that, like, people obviously want for, like, political content, because you have one side that's concerned about misinformation and the other side that's concerned about a dictator or a small elite trying to, like, silence them by just arbitrarily deciding that they're misinformation. And so having, like, this more democratic mechanism that avoids being controlled by a small elite and even tries to kind of be cross-tribal, right? So even tries to avoid being, like, taken over by one tribe, is something that's, like, really powerful, and that a lot of people clearly really want. And so the goal, I think, is to, like, try to find at least, like, 10 to 20 other things that are in that spirit across like all kinds of spaces, whether we're talking, like, social media, whether we're talking, like, funding decisions, the local government, national government, also like applications inside of blockchains, and like actually roll them out.
Glenn, Audrey, and Pluralist have hinted Ethereum is the most important infrastructure to power the vision of plurality. For plurality, its goal is to be popularized by NGOs, nation-state governments, multinational corporations, and even the United Nations and the European Union. So how does Ethereum plan to persuade these counterparties to trust and integrate Ethereum?
Yeah, and institutional applications of of Ethereum and, like, blockchain technology is something that people have tried to do for a long time, and, like, obviously so far it's been unsuccessful. Like, I remember 5 to 10 years ago, the big trend that everyone was excited about was private blockchains, right? Or sometimes like consortium blockchains, private chains, enterprise chains. Like this idea that like you can try to create something that's like a little more decentralized than servers, but like obviously not totally decentralized and scary like public blockchains, and like try to create like a compromise in the middle. But like the compromise obviously ended up failing, right? Like we just haven't seen like in that many of these enterprise blockchain applications like actually work. And I think the reason is that they ended up creating the wrong kind of compromise. Because by not working with the public chain, they basically abandoned the ability to benefit from like the really largest community's network effects, right? And there was this phenomenon that I personally noticed when I tried talking to a lot of these teams, where they would like first create a consortium, and then the first 5 maybe clients would show up. They'd be very happy. They'd be very excited, but then it would never grow to past 5, right? Because if you're the first 5, then like you have a lot of control, you can set the direction. But then if you're number 6 or you're number 13, then like, you have no power and you're joining a system that's like at the whims of these other groups, right? And so the kind of compromise that between centralization and decentralization that I think makes a lot more sense is combining blockchains and zero-knowledge proofs, right? So you use blockchains potentially like not even as a way to publish all of the data, but maybe as a way to publish like hashes of the data, right? And then you use zero-knowledge proofs, and you publish a proof along with every hash to prove that whatever happens to update the hash, that it was updated correctly, right? So what's interesting about this approach is that the level of like tie to the blockchain from a technical level is like pretty minimal, right? But you still get the benefits, right? You still get a user's ability to like have a Merkle proof and actually prove that like they have an entry in the database and it was calculated correctly. One of the easiest, I think, and like most interesting applications of this in the very short term is proof of solvency for exchanges, right? So exchanges, like one of the big problems they've always had is this question of like, well, what if they're actually a fractional reserve and they're stealing people's money, right? Like last decade, it was Mt. Gox. This decade, it was FTX. And if nothing changes next decade, it'll be something else. With proof of solvency, what you can do is you can create a proof that proves that for every coin of user assets that are in like people's balances, you actually have an underlying coin that is being stored somewhere that you control. What's interesting about this is that like you can describe it as being a proof of solvency like application and based on ZK snarks, or you can describe it as a Validium. You can describe it as basically the exchange turning into a type of layer 2 of Ethereum. And like from a technical perspective, both ways of understanding it are valid, right? But like that just is an institutional application of Ethereum that just makes a huge amount of sense, right? Now that's kind of like the beginning. And I think the nice thing about this kind of approach is that you can keep the way that your application already works, right? You have a server, you can keep your server. You just add an extra piece of software on the side that just reads the database, does some extra computation, generates some proofs, and publishes them onto the chain. And if you do that, then like you're just bolting extra security onto an existing system, and you're giving users the extra ability to make these proofs that they would then be able to do and use, right? So I think, yeah, part of the reason why this has not happened yet really is just technical capability. Like, so much depends on zero-knowledge proofs, right? Blockchains give you guarantees of like guaranteed execution, openness, censorship resistance, but they give you these guarantees at the cost of scalability and privacy. Scalability and privacy are both a very big deal. What do zero-knowledge proofs do? They give you back scalability and privacy. 5 years ago, zero-knowledge proofs were like still mostly a theoretical academic thing, right? Now, Zcash, like the zero-knowledge proof-based cryptocurrency that does privacy, launched at the end of 2016. And I remember the very first version. To generate a proof, you needed to have a laptop. You could not do it on a phone at all. And even on a laptop, it would take 90 seconds to generate a proof. Today, to do the same thing, you can generate a proof on a phone in like less than 4 seconds, right? So that's the user experience. Then the developer experience. To make a zero-knowledge proof application before about 2021, you basically would have to be a cryptographer yourself. But today you can just write code in Circom, it gets compiled. You don't actually have to understand or interface with the cryptography yourself, right? So user tools, developer tools, like it all is just becoming more powerful very quickly, right? So from a technical standpoint, a lot of the problems actually are being solved. So now I think is the time to like really actually start figuring out like what are the specific things that really make sense and just actually start implementing them.
And the gas fee of Ethereum is still high, and the transaction speed is not necessarily the fastest. Do you think this is the main reason why the spirit of Cypherpunk cannot be greatly realized? And with the upcoming Dencun upgrade, to what extent can we solve this problem?
Yeah, and I think high transaction fees are definitely like probably the main thing that's preventing a lot of the most interesting applications of Ethereum from succeeding more. The main way that the Ethereum ecosystem has decided to deal with this problem is layer 2s, right? And layer 2s have started to exist. And I think the big accomplishment of last year is that we have at least one layer 2, Arbitrum, that has reached what we call stage 1, which is basically a stage at which like it's actually giving at least most of the power an actual proof system that like actually directly like reads and checks, verifies EVM computation. So it's like it actually is more secure than like just putting all of the money into a multi-sig, right? The layer 2s are making a lot of progress, and they're going to make more progress this year. Then at the same time, though, like the layer 2s also have one scalability bottleneck, which is that they still need to put some amount of data on chain with every transaction, right? And the goal of EIP 4844, the blobs, is to create this extra space where you can put extra data on chain, and it's processed in a way that makes it cheaper, right? In the short term, it's just basically processed in a way that makes it easier to download in parallel and easier to throw out after some period of time. But then in the long term, there's this goal of using a technology called data availability sampling, which you can use to, like, nodes in the chain will be able to verify that the data is there without having to actually download all of it directly, right? So that, like, the goal of all these things is to increase the amount of data space that rollups can use, and by doing so, decrease the transaction fees and increase the scalability of rollups even further.
So we saw you mention AD/ACC in your blog. Although technology could speed up the advancement of society, we cannot tell if the direction is good or bad. Ethereum's Merge might be the greatest success in the history of blockchains as it transitions from POW to POS. As you lead this transition, what were some of the trade-offs and difficult decisions you and the community have made that contributed to the success of this merge? And were there any open collaboration experiences and insights that have been instrumental to ensuring the direction is good?
And I think with the change to proof of stake, one of the important things that we did was, like, this was something that was discussed in the Ethereum community, like, almost from the beginning, right? And I think when you're making a big change to a system that, like, lots of people depend on and lots of people have expectations around, like, really being clear with the community what you're doing and like just, respecting the people is something that's really important, right? I mean, I think the one kind of counterexample that, like, I gave also in that post, right, is with the recent OpenAI situation, right? The board basically, like, tried to fire Sam Altman, but then for a very long time, they basically just, like, refused to give any kind of public reasoning for why they did it, right? This, I mean, obviously, you think offended a lot of people, right? Because it's like, on the one hand, like, OpenAI itself was basically saying, like, hey, AI is super dangerous. We're going to try very hard to do it responsibly. But then, like, basically ended up acting like this, like, very unaccountable and centralized thing, right? And like, basically just, like, springing this big decision and change in direction on people, like, very suddenly without like, any warning and any explanation, right? So in the case of the proof of stake switch, like, this was something that we were talking about since, the beginning of 2014, right? And so people who were in Ethereum knew that like the switch to proof of stake was being in development from the beginning. So I think that was one thing that was done well, right? Just like making it clear that it's part of the roadmap. I think like there were definitely things that were done less well, but probably the big one is just like underestimating the complexity of the transition, right? I think had we known how complex it would be, we definitely would have picked a much simpler version of proof of stake to start with so that we would be able to get to it quickly and more quickly be able to switch focus and really start working hard on scalability. So like that's a mistake, and I think it is a mistake that we've learned from. Yeah, and then going forward into the future, there's this Ethereum roadmap doc that I publish every year, basically trying to summarize like what the like research and dev teams direction for Ethereum is, and like what kinds of things people are trying to do and implement. And what's interesting is that the amount of change in the roadmap has actually like gotten smaller and smaller, right? Like if you look at the change between 2020 and 2021 and 21 to 22 to 23, and then now this last, well, end of 22 to end of 23, that the change there is much, much smaller, right? Like there are still things that are being changed. I think the big one is just the realization that we have to like come up with some solution to staking centralization. But aside from that, like not that much change, right? Yeah, so I think just like handling the community side of like all of at least like the remaining significant transitions is definitely one of the important things to do well. So far, just continuing to do the kinds of things that like we've been saying Ethereum is trying to do the whole time.
AI and AGI conflict. What do you think is going to happen to human society, and how may Plurality play a role?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we're living in a very important time right now, right? Like this is basically, the last century before just like humanity and our entire world becomes something that's just like very unimaginably different from anything that we're used to right now, right? And it's a time when, change is already happening, and, we could fully expect change to just start accelerating more and more. And this is a transition in which there's a lot of challenges, right? There's, obviously, AI itself has a lot of risks, like, right? Like, like if a super intelligent AI gets created that has, like different goals from humanity, then like that could be a big risk to, like even humanity's survival. Then, even if that risk gets managed, then there's the whole other risk of like, will that enable like forms of centralized power and totalitarianism that were just totally not possible before? And like here, like it's not just like a theoretical issue, right? Like, we're even seeing the impact of just like the modern, like machine learning, facial recognition, and surveillance cameras on a lot of countries' ability to detect and suppress protesters in all kinds of ways, right? And unfortunately, this is like one of those things that was used pretty effectively against the Russian opposition over the last 5 to 10 years. It's being used more and more in other places, right? And so the question is like, we have technologies that basically allow companies with 35 employees to serve 1 billion people. And like, might it not be the case that those same technologies would allow a political elite with only 35 people to dominate 1 billion people in a way that, like once it's put in place, can't be escaped from, right? It's so there's definitely big risks in here in all kinds of directions. I think it's important to think about those risks, and this is one of the reasons why just like think maintaining things like all these open source like principles is so valuable, right? Like if you think about like even brain-computer interfaces, for example, like I very bullish on them. I think it could be amazing. Like it could feel like you being able to just understand every language and just multiply 20-digit numbers in your head. But on the other hand, like we're literally talking about computers reading your mind, right? And computers are created by large groups of people, and they're created by large groups of people that include companies like Google and Facebook and Huawei and like whatever else. And there's like a lot of trust that we're putting in like centralized groups of people, right? So trying to make those things be as kind of security focused and open as possible is like one of those things that's valuable. I think for Plurality in particular, the way that I see this is that in a lot of these cases, there's a lot of value in being able to uncover consensuses that like already actually exist, but people just don't realize that they exist, right? And just like being able to quickly like find points of agreement on like even questions like what kind of technology should we really like either subsidize or just like put a lot of like extra effort into at a particular moment. And if there aren't good ways of getting consensus, then like what's happened historically is that role gets filled by elites. And the more that role gets filled by elites, the more like elites can use that to grab and maintain power for themselves, right? And so actually like having those kinds of consensuses happen in a way that is like secure and that actually gives us access to like information that we did not have before could potentially allow for higher quality of decision making. And I think that's something that could be super valuable for all kinds of decisions, especially as the world just like becomes extremely rapidly changing. And in the final decade before whatever happens with AI, like hopefully it makes the world like unbelievably awesome, or in the worst case makes it terrible. Like in the decade before that happens, everything we know about the world will probably like overturn every 2 or 3 years, right? And like that's something that's going to be like a real challenge to manage well, and like being able to just preserve a lot of the properties of the world that we care about going through that is something that we'll have to like work together and work hard on. And I think we're hopeful that these Plurality ideas can help there.